The night before the funeral, the mansion on Willow Creek Hill always fell silent at night. The kind of silence that seemed to echo, wrapping its arms around the white marble walls and the sweeping staircase like an unseen veil. But on this night, that silence was broken by a single heartbeat, soft, faint, almost hidden, inside the grand bedroom of Mrs. Isabel Whitmore. Maya Thompson, 27, moved quietly through the dim hallway, clutching a folded blanket to her chest as a disguise. Her dark maid uniform blended with the shadows, and the soft sound of her shoes on the polished wood disappeared beneath the distant hum of the generator. She shouldn't have been here after hours. No maid was allowed near the West Wing at night, not since Isabel had passed away 3 days earlier. Maya stopped outside the door. Her breath caught. She remembered the day she'd first stepped into this house, young, nervous, clutching her resume like it was a lifeline. Isabel had smiled at her, not the condescending smile most rich people gave, but a warm one, the kind that saw you. "You have honest eyes," she had said. "I trust honest eyes." Now that same woman lay cold, or so everyone said, behind the door. But Maya's instincts screamed something was wrong. The night Isabel died, Maya had been the one changing her bedsheets. She'd seen Isabel's fingers twitch. She'd felt a strange warmth in her wrist. But the doctors, the assistant Naomi, and even Mr. Richard Whitmore, the billionaire himself, had accepted the verdict without question. Heart failure, no autopsy, immediate preparations. Maya pressed her ear to the heavy oak door. Silence. Her trembling hand found the brass handle. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then turned it slowly. The door opened with a low creak. Inside, moonlight spilled across the room, painting the antique furniture in shades of silver and blue. Isabel's body lay on the bed, covered in a white satin sheet, surrounded by lilies. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. Maya's eyes welled as she stepped closer. "Ma'am." Her voice broke. "I don't believe you're gone." She placed her hand lightly on Isabel's wrist. Nothing. She pressed a little harder. Still nothing. Her heart sank. But then, as her fingers shifted slightly up the arm, she felt it. A whisper. A tremor. A pulse so faint she might have imagined it if she weren't trained to clean this woman's sheets for years and knew every inch of this room like her own heartbeat. Maya gasped softly. "Oh my God." She pulled out her phone from her apron and opened the voice recorder. 02:13 a.m., she whispered into the mic. "I feel a pulse on Mrs. Whitmore's wrist. It's faint but present. I repeat, pulse is present." She was about to run and call Richard when something made her stop. Earlier that day, she'd overheard Naomi Clark, the personal assistant, speaking in hushed tones near the kitchen phone. Naomi wasn't grieving, she was giving instructions. "The dosage has to mimic death, slow the heart, suppress breathing. I want her declared by morning. No mistakes." Maya had ducked behind the pantry door. She hadn't seen the man Naomi was speaking to, but she'd recognized fear in Naomi's voice. Not fear of Isabel dying, but of someone finding out. Maya switched her phone to video mode and slowly approached the cabinet where Naomi often kept files. She turned the camera toward the bedside table. A tiny syringe cap glinted beneath the lamp. She zoomed in. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might wake Isabel. "Why would there be a syringe here?" she muttered. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maya froze. The handle turned. She dove behind the curtain just as Naomi entered, her silhouette tall and sharp in the moonlight. Naomi walked straight to the bed, leaned over Isabel and whispered, "By tomorrow all this will be mine." Maya's eyes widened. She kept recording. Naomi reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a burner phone and dialed. Yes, it worked. She's stable in the sense that she looks dead. The funeral's tomorrow. After that, it's done. Don't call this number again. Maya bit her lip to keep from gasping. Her fingers shook as she stopped recording and slipped the USB stick she always carried into her phone to transfer the file. Her cousin had once told her, "Never keep evidence only on your phone. Upload it or hide it. She inserted the USB, hit transfer, and whispered, "Come on, come on." Naomi turned suddenly. Maya's heart nearly stopped. But Naomi only adjusted the curtain, frowned, and walked out, heels clicking like gunshots. The moment the door clicked shut, Maya exhaled shakily. She grabbed the USB, yanked it out, and slipped it inside the hem of her uniform, where the stitching was loose. Her hands were slick with sweat. She knelt beside Isabel again. "Hold on, ma'am," she whispered. "I know you can hear me. I'm not going to let them bury you alive." The morning of the funeral, Maya didn't sleep. She paced her tiny maid's quarters, replaying the video over and over. Each time, her disbelief hardened into resolve. She had to speak. She had to stop the funeral. But how could a maid, a black maid at that, in a house where no one listened to her unless she was serving drinks, convince a room full of billionaires that their beloved matriarch wasn't dead? The funeral was scheduled for 10 a.m. at St. Helena's Chapel. Every major figure in the city was expected to attend. CEOs, politicians, socialites. Maya's presence would be noticed. But she also knew, if she said nothing, Isabel would be buried alive. She stared at her uniform in the mirror. The black dress looked plain, unremarkable, but in her chest a fire burned. "You told me I had honest eyes," she whispered to her reflection. "Then you better believe me now." At the chapel. The chapel was breathtaking, a century-old stone structure with stained glass windows and golden chandeliers. Rows of mourners in black filled the pews. Maya stood at the back, clutching her worn handbag where the USB lay hidden. At the front, the casket sat beneath a cascade of white roses. Richard Whitmore stood like a statue beside it, tall, powerful, but broken. He'd loved Isabel deeply. Everyone knew it. Beside him, Naomi stood poised, her black veil perfectly arranged, her eyes cold and calculating. The funeral director raised his gloved hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to close the casket." Maya's breath caught. This was it, now or never. She stepped forward, her voice trembling at first, then rising. "She's still alive." Heads turned. Whispers rose like wind through dry leaves. "Who is that?" "That's the maid." "What is she doing?" Maya didn't hear them. She saw only the casket. "She's still alive," she cried again, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't bury her. She's alive." The violinist froze mid-note. The room fell silent. 2 security guards began to move. Naomi's face twisted, but Maya stood her ground. Her knuckles whitened as she held up the USB. "I have proof." Naomi injected her with something to make her look dead. "It's all on this. Please check her pulse. Please," Naomi snapped. "Get her out of here." But Richard raised his hand. "Wait." His voice trembled. "Give me that." Maya stepped forward, placed the USB in his palm. "Please," she whispered. "Just check her pulse." The shocking truth, Lauren, Isabel's niece and a nurse, rushed forward with a portable monitor. The room held its breath as she pressed the device against Isabel's wrist. The screen blinked. Once, twice. Then, a faint line appeared. "She has a pulse," Lauren whispered. Chaos erupted. People gasped. Richard staggered back. "What?" "She's alive," Lauren repeated louder. "Call an ambulance." Maya dropped to her knees, sobbing with relief. Naomi's mask slipped for a moment. Fear flickered in her eyes. But it was too late. The sirens wailed outside as paramedics stormed in. Richard turned to the crowd, voice like thunder. "Whoever did this will pay." Whispers in the hospital. The ambulance tore through the city streets, siren wailing, its flashing red and blue lights slicing through the early morning fog. Inside the back of the vehicle, Richard Whitmore sat stiffly on the bench, his trembling hands gripping Isabel's frail fingers. He couldn't take his eyes off the faint rise and fall of her chest beneath the oxygen mask. The woman he had thought was gone forever, the one he had wept for, the one he had prepared to bury, was still here. Alive. Fragile, but alive. The reality pressed down on him with both unbearable relief and paralyzing dread. Beside him, a paramedic monitored her vitals. occasionally calling out numbers in clipped urgent tones. Richard barely heard them. His mind kept circling back to Maya's words, to the USB clenched so tightly in his pocket that it left an imprint in his palm. In the chaos of the chapel, he had felt his world tilt off its axis. First the maid screaming about life where there should have been death, then the USB, the trembling confession, the proof she claimed she had against Naomi, the woman who had been by his side through every corporate deal, every personal crisis, for nearly a decade. Could it be true? Could Naomi, the one who had handled Isabel's medication, appointments, even the doctor's visits, have orchestrated something so monstrous? He thought of Isabel's will, of the company shares, of the empire she had helped him build. Naomi had always been ambitious, but ambition was one thing. This was something else, something darker. By the time they reached St. Helena Medical Center, a private hospital reserved for the city's elite, Richard was pale and shaken. He followed the stretcher through the shining glass doors, surrounded by security and medical staff. Cameras were already flashing outside. News had leaked from the chapel, and journalists shouted questions that ricocheted against the stone walls of the hospital entrance. Is it true she's alive? Mr. Whitmore, was this a staged death? Who is the maid who saved her? Richard ignored them all, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the fragile form of his wife as she was wheeled away. Maya arrived moments later, escorted by 2 guards who had initially tried to throw her out of the chapel. She looked small and exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands still trembling from the confrontation. Yet as she stepped inside the hospital lobby, her presence was like a spark. Staff members turned their heads. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and even the reporters craned their necks to glimpse her, the maid who had stopped a funeral, the woman who had dared to shout at billionaires and had been right. Richard caught sight of her across the lobby. For a moment his stern features softened. He motioned for the guards to release her. When she approached, he spoke quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. You saved her life, Maya. If you hadn't... He broke off, pressing a hand to his forehead. God, I don't even want to think about what we almost did. Maya swallowed hard, her courage flickering but not extinguished. Sir, I need you to watch that USB. Naomi, she's behind this. I heard her. I saw the syringe cap. She was planning to bury Mrs. Whitmore alive. If you don't act now, she'll destroy the evidence. Richard's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. He had always considered himself a man of control, someone who could smell deception a mile away. And yet, here he was, blindsided in the most personal betrayal imaginable. He nodded once grimly. I'll see it myself. But if what you're saying is true, then Naomi Clark has just signed her own sentence. The recovery room hours later, Isabel lay in a private recovery suite, hooked to machines that beeped rhythmically, confirming what Maya had known all along: she was alive. Unconscious, heavily sedated by the very drugs that had mimicked death, but alive. A team of specialists moved in and out, adjusting drips, monitoring vitals, whispering among themselves in disbelief. They had never seen a case quite like this. Maya stood at the corner of the room, watching with quiet vigilance. She had refused to leave Isabel's side, despite the disapproving looks from certain staff who still saw her only as the maid. But every time she glanced at the frail woman in the bed, she remembered the kindness Isabel had once shown her, the advice, the encouragement, the respect. Isabel had been the first person in Maya's life who made her feel visible, and now, Maya was determined to repay that debt. Richard entered the room later that evening, looking older, heavier than he had that morning. In his hand was the USB drive. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked to the window, staring at the fading sunset as if trying to gather the strength to confront the storm. Then he turned, his face carved in shadow. I saw the video, he said quietly. Everything you said, it's there. Naomi's voice. Her orders. Her lies. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. All these years I trusted her with everything, and she tried to kill my wife. Maya clasped her hands together. What will you do, sir? Richard's gaze hardened. What I should have done long ago. I'll protect Isabel, and I'll make sure Naomi never harms anyone again. But even as he spoke, the door opened and Naomi herself stepped inside, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her face as calm as if nothing had happened. She wore a sharp suit now, her veil discarded, her expression carefully composed. Richard, she said smoothly, as though she had every right to be there. "I came as soon as I heard." "How is she?" Maya's breath caught. The audacity of the woman stunned her. Richard stiffened, his eyes narrowing into slits. He did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched like a blade between them. Naomi shifted her gaze to Maya, her smile brittle. "Still playing the hero, are we, Maid? You really should stay in your place." Maya's fist clenched, but before she could respond, Richard stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Naomi, I know everything." For the first time, Naomi's mask faltered. Her eyes flickered. "What are you talking about?" "The USB, Richard said coldly. "Your voice. Your orders. Injecting drugs to make Isabel appear dead. You tried to kill her. And if Maya hadn't stopped you, you would have buried her alive." The color drained from Naomi's face, but only for a moment. Then she laughed softly, shaking her head as though at a child's foolish lie. "Richard, you can't be serious. That maid has manipulated you. She's desperate for attention, maybe money. Do you really think I would risk everything I've built with you?" "This is absurd," but Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't think, Naomi, I know." Naomi's eyes darted between them, searching for an escape. She straightened her shoulders, her voice smooth again. "Very well. If that's what you believe, then you'll hear from my lawyer. Because if you try to smear my name with baseless accusations, I'll destroy you both." She turned sharply on her heel and walked out, leaving behind a silence that crackled with tension. Maya trembled, but Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't be afraid. She's cornered now. And when people like Naomi are cornered, their true nature comes out. We just have to be ready." The seeds of war over the next few days, Isabel's condition stabilized, but she remained unconscious. Rumors swirled in the media. Headlines speculated about medical miracles, foul play, and the mysterious maid who had become an unlikely heroine. Reporters camped outside the hospital, hungry for answers. Inside, Richard's legal team began compiling evidence from the USB, cross-checking Naomi's phone records, bank transactions, and private communications. What they uncovered painted a picture darker than anyone could have imagined. Bribes, offshore accounts, and secret meetings with rival board members who had everything to gain from Isabel's removal. For Maya, the days blurred into long hours by Isabel's bedside, whispering encouragement to the unconscious woman, praying she would wake and tell her own story. Sometimes she felt Isabel's fingers twitch faintly as if in response. Other times she thought she saw the slightest flicker of eyelids. Each small sign fueled her determination. But not everyone was grateful. Among the Whitmore household staff, whispers spread like wildfire. Some envied Maya's sudden rise to attention. Others feared the consequences of her accusations against someone as powerful as Naomi. One evening, as Maya returned to her quarters, she found her belongings tossed across the floor, her mattress slashed open, her few personal photographs shredded. A note lay on the table, scrawled in sharp black ink. "Stop, or you'll regret it." Maya's hands shook as she picked it up. She knew exactly who had sent it. Naomi might have been cornered, but she was far from powerless. Still, when Maya looked back toward the west wing of the hospital where Isabel lay, she felt the fire inside her burn stronger. She whispered to herself, "I won't stop. Not until the truth comes out, not until justice is done." The web titans the following week felt like a storm gathering strength. Every hour carried new revelations, hushed conversations and shadows that seemed to lengthen down the sterile corridors of St. Helena Medical Center. Isabel remained unconscious, but her presence was like a quiet heartbeat beneath the chaos, steady, fragile, and undeniable. Around her bed, a quiet vigil formed. Doctors adjusted machines. Nurses checked vitals, and Maya kept her post, vigilant and unwavering, as if her very will could shield Isabel from the dangers beyond the hospital walls. Richard Whitmore had spent his life navigating boardrooms where deception was currency. But this was different. This was not a rival company or a hostile takeover. This was betrayal that had unfolded inside his home. Within the walls he thought were safe. After watching the footage on the USB again and again, his fury had evolved from shock to cold, surgical determination. His lawyers and private investigators worked around the clock, peeling away layers of Naomi's dealings like surgeons cutting through diseased tissue. They uncovered offshore transactions, encrypted communications, and a series of shell companies that funneled money from obscure accounts into holdings registered under Naomi's relatives' names. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a carefully woven web that had been years in the making. Naomi Clark had always been meticulous. She was the kind of woman who memorized passwords, who anticipated board votes before they happened, who had Richard's entire schedule in her head. For years she had positioned herself as indispensable, but the more Richard's team dug, the clearer it became that her loyalty had always been to herself. Her plan had been chillingly simple: eliminate Isabel without drawing suspicion, ensure Isabel's estate transitioned smoothly, then consolidate control by becoming Richard's closest ally, perhaps even his future wife. With Isabel gone, Naomi would have been untouchable, but she hadn't accounted for one thing: the maid who noticed what no one else did. Maya's days blurred into a rhythm of care and caution. She woke early, checked Isabel's vitals, whispered encouraging words, and walked the hospital halls with quiet resolve. The nurses respected her now. Some even came to her with questions about the patient's baseline, amazed by how deeply Maya knew Isabel's habits. But the newfound respect came with dangers. Twice she noticed unfamiliar men lingering near Isabel's room. Once she found that the backup power to Isabel's monitor had been inexplicably disconnected. These were not coincidences. She started locking the room whenever she left and kept a small camera hidden on the shelf facing the door. A gift from one of the sympathetic nurses who believed her when she said, "Someone is still trying to finish what they started." Outside, the media frenzy escalated. Headlines called it the funeral miracle, the billionaire's wife who came back from the dead, and the maid who stopped time. Talk shows speculated endlessly. Some portrayed Maya as a heroine. Others hinted at conspiracy theories suggesting the entire thing was a publicity stunt. Richard gave no interviews, refusing to fuel the circus. But in boardrooms and legal chambers, he was quietly repositioning his empire, removing Naomi's access piece by piece, revoking her credentials, and calling for a surprise audit that would send shockwaves through the Whitmore Group. Naomi, however, was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. She still had powerful allies, board members who had benefited from her secret dealings, lawyers who owed her favors, and a network of people who underestimated a maid but feared a strategist like her. She launched her own counterattack. One morning, a series of online articles appeared, questioning Maya's background, painting her as a manipulative opportunist who had inserted herself into the billionaire's household drama for personal gain. Old photographs of Maya's family were dug up. Stories were twisted, and anonymous sources described her as obsessively attached to Isabel. Maya read those headlines in the break room, her hands shaking as the words bled into each other. She had expected resistance, but the brutality of the lies hit her like a physical blow. She had worked her entire life to prove her worth through honesty and hard work, and now strangers were dissecting her character like vultures over a carcass. One nurse placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but Maya managed a tight smile. "They can say what they want," she whispered. "The truth doesn't bend for them." Still, when she walked down the hall, she could feel the shift in how some staff members looked at her. Not all, but enough to remind her that Naomi was pulling strings from the shadows. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled boardroom atop the Whitmore Group's skyscraper, Richard convened an emergency meeting. The room was filled with men and women in dark suits, faces set in masks of professionalism. Naomi sat among them, immaculate in a crisp white blouse and black blazer, as though nothing had happened. Richard entered late, carrying a slim black folder. The moment he spoke, the air changed. "We have evidence," he began, voice low but carrying, "that certain individuals within this board have been colluding with Naomi Clark to undermine the estate of my wife. This evidence includes financial transfers, recorded conversations, and strategic documents. I've called this meeting to make something clear. That ends now." Naomi's smile was tight. "Richard, these are very serious allegations. If you're going to throw them around, you'd better have something real." Richard interrupted her by sliding the USB across the table. "Play it." The legal counsel connected it to the screen. Naomi's voice filled the room, giving instructions to inject drugs, demanding the death be declared, setting timelines. The room fell into stunned silence. Some shifted in their chairs. Others avoided her gaze. Naomi's mask cracked just for a heartbeat, an almost imperceptible flicker of panic before she recomposed herself. "This is edited," she snapped, taken out of context. "It proves nothing. But the board members were not fools. They knew the sound of self-preservation when they heard it. A murmur spread through the room, not of support but of distance, the sound of people stepping away from a sinking ship. Richard leaned forward, his voice ice. This company was built on integrity. Anyone who stands with her stands against me, and against Isabel. Choose wisely. That night, Maya returned to Isabel's room to find something extraordinary. Isabel's eyelids fluttered. For the first time in weeks, her fingers gripped Maya's hand with faint, trembling strength. Maya leaned forward, tears filling her eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you hear me?" Isabel's lips parted. No words came out, but the faintest sound emerged, a breath that carried the weight of survival. Maya called for the doctors, who rushed in astonished. Vitals began to strengthen. Richard arrived moments later, stunned into silence as he saw the woman he loved inching her way back to life. The timing couldn't have been more crucial. For Naomi, the noose was tightening. Her accounts were being frozen. Her allies were wavering. And worst of all, the woman she had tried to silence forever was beginning to wake up. She stood in her penthouse that night, staring out at the glittering city with a glass of wine in hand, her reflection cold in the window. If she wakes up, she whispered to herself, everything burns. When the sleeping lion stirs, the morning sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds like thin golden threads, weaving across the sterile floor and the quiet hum of machines. For the first time in weeks, there was a new energy inside Isabel Whitmore's private recovery suite. A subtle but powerful current that seemed to ripple through every corner of the room. Maya noticed it the moment she stepped in. Isabel's fingers no longer lay limp on the sheets. They flexed with a faint tremor, almost as if her body were trying to speak before her lips could form words. Maya approached the bedside with quiet reverence, clutching the small notebook where she had recorded every shift in Isabel's vitals, every whispered prayer, every heartbeat that had defied death itself. The doctor entered soon after, his expression professional but unable to fully mask his intrigue. "She's showing signs of neurological response," he said, studying the monitors. "If this continues, we may begin light cognitive stimulation to ease her out of the drug-induced coma." It's remarkable, frankly. She shouldn't have survived that dosage, let alone begun recovery this fast. His eyes flicked to Maya with a mixture of respect and curiosity. If you hadn't noticed the signs, she would have been in the ground by now. Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her gaze remained fixed on Isabel, willing her to fight her way back to the world. She remembered the way Isabel had once told her during a quiet afternoon in the garden, that strength doesn't always come from being the loudest. It often comes from simply refusing to disappear. Now Isabel's body was proving that truth word by word, heartbeat by heartbeat. Elsewhere in the city, however, Naomi Clark was not sleeping. She spent the night in her penthouse pacing like a caged predator. Her carefully constructed empire was crumbling. The board had turned cold. Richard had stripped her of access, the media narrative was slipping, and worst of all, Isabel was stirring. The one woman who could expose everything with a single sentence was slowly crawling back to consciousness. Naomi's mind, sharp and calculating, began to weave new threads. If she couldn't silence Isabel in the coffin, she would have to do it in the hospital. She called an old associate, a man whose loyalty was tied to the weight of cash, not conscience. Their conversation was brief but heavy with implication. "No witnesses," she said into the phone. "This is your last job for me. Make it look like a medical failure, quiet, clean." Her voice didn't waver. Naomi had spent her entire career hiding poison beneath silk. This was no different, only more urgent. Back at the hospital, Maya's vigilance grew sharper. She had learned to read people the way some read books, and over the last few days, subtle disturbances had become louder. A janitor who lingered too long outside the door, a nurse she'd never seen before asking unnecessary questions, a clipboard left behind with altered medication dosages. She began sleeping in a chair beside Isabel's bed, refusing to leave even when Richard's security detail insisted they had everything under control. "With all due respect, sir," she told them quietly, "I'm not leaving her. I know what danger looks like when it wears a friendly face." Richard, watching from the doorway one evening, felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. Maya had risked everything, her reputation, her job, even her safety, to save Isabel. Meanwhile, he, a man with unimaginable resources, had been blind to the treachery under his nose. He approached her as the night shift settled in, his suit jacket discarded, his face weary but determined. Maya, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. When this is over, things won't go back to how they were. You've changed everything. Maya shook her head. I didn't do this to change anything for me, sir. I did it because she believed in me when no one else did. You don't walk away from that kind of faith. Richard nodded slowly. In that moment, he understood that loyalty wasn't bought. It was earned in quiet moments of truth. Days passed and Isabel's progress accelerated. She opened her eyes for the first time on a crisp Tuesday morning. The room fell into stunned silence as her gaze, still clouded with confusion, moved from the ceiling to Maya's face. Her fingers tightened weakly around Maya's hand, a gesture so small yet so monumental that tears sprang to Maya's eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, she whispered, choking back emotion. You're safe now. You're with people who love you. The doctors rushed in, assessing neurological responses, adjusting medication, preparing for a long road of recovery. Isabel couldn't speak yet. Her throat was dry and her muscles weak. But her eyes, those sharp, commanding eyes that had once led boardrooms and philanthropic missions alike, were alive. And in those eyes Maya saw not fear but fury. Richard entered the room minutes later. When Isabel's gaze met his, something in him broke. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, pressing her hand to his forehead. I thought I lost you, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Her fingers brushed his hair lightly, a silent forgiveness passing between them like an old, familiar language. The reunion, however, did not go unnoticed. Outside the hospital, Naomi's associate slipped through a side entrance using forged credentials. Dressed as a maintenance worker, he carried a toolbox that held more than wrenches. He had studied the floor plan, knew the shifts, knew exactly how long the security cameras rotated before looping. His target was a simple switch in Isabel's IV line, a chemical compound that would stop her heart in under 2 minutes, leaving behind no obvious trace. But what he hadn't accounted for was Maya's sleepless intuition. That night, as the hospital settled into its hushed rhythm, Maya noticed the faintest sound outside the room. A metallic click, like a tool being set down carefully. She stood, heart pounding, and peered through the narrow window in the door. A man in maintenance coveralls stood by the panel, his movements too deliberate to be routine. She didn't think. She acted. She opened the door suddenly, her voice steady. Can I help you? The man froze for a fraction of a second, just enough to give away his intent. He muttered something about checking the wiring, but Maya's eyes fell on the toolbox. It was too clean, too heavy for a simple electrical fix. She stepped between him and Isabel's bed, blocking his path. You're not on tonight's roster, she said. I know every maintenance worker here. Who sent you? The man's jaw tightened. He reached for something inside the box, but before he could pull it out, Richard's security team, alerted by Maya's sharp instincts, burst into the room. In seconds, the intruder was on the ground, disarmed, handcuffed. As they dragged him away, Maya stared at the toolbox and felt a chill crawl up her spine. Naomi had made her move. The incident hardened Richard's resolve. He called an emergency press conference the next day, revealing publicly that Isabel had been the target of an attempted murder, that the culprit behind the original scheme in this new attack was under investigation, and that evidence would be handed directly to federal authorities. His voice, calm and controlled, sent shockwaves through the corporate world. He didn't mention Naomi by name, but those who needed to understand, understood. Naomi watched the press conference from her penthouse, her glass of wine trembling slightly in her hand. She had underestimated Maya again. What had once been a nameless maid was now the immovable obstacle standing between her and victory. She threw the glass against the wall, watching it shatter, the red wine dripping like blood down the pristine surface. Fine, she whispered to the empty room. If they want a war, they'll get one. The echo of truth, the 7th week of the trial, dawned beneath a steel-gray sky, the air heavy with anticipation. The courthouse steps were already crowded before sunrise. Reporters jostled for position, their breath visible in the cold morning air, while the public gathered with banners, waiting for the moment justice would finally speak. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, every seat filled, every whisper charged with the knowledge that this was the day everything would end. Maya stood in a quiet hallway before entering the courtroom, her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. The maid's black dress that had once defined her place in the Whitmore household had been replaced by a simple navy suit. a symbol not of wealth, but of quiet dignity earned through resilience. She stared at her reflection in a window, remembering the woman she had been months ago, invisible, afraid to raise her voice, accepting of a world where people like her were supposed to stand in the background. Now she was about to witness the culmination of a fight she never asked for but refused to walk away from. Inside the courtroom, Naomi sat at the defense table with a stillness that bordered on defiance. Her carefully crafted image had been shredded over the past weeks, but she clung to a final veneer of control. She wore white today, a deliberate choice, a last attempt to project innocence. Her eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Maya, then on Isabel, who sat near the front in a tailored cream suit, her posture regal despite the cane resting by her chair. Isabel's recovery had accelerated. Her voice was strong again, and her presence carried the same commanding aura that once dominated boardrooms. Richard entered moments later, his face grave but composed. He carried no visible anger now, only a quiet resolve. Betrayal had once burned through him like wildfire, but now it had cooled into something sharper, steadier. The resolve of a man who had seen truth tear away illusion. The judge's gavel brought the room to silence as proceedings began. The jury had deliberated for 36 hours, long enough to make the waiting unbearable but not long enough to suggest doubt. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in trembling hands. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. Around her, the world seemed to hold its breath. On the charge of attempted murder, the jury found Naomi Clark guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering and attempted obstruction of justice, guilty. Each word fell like a hammer on stone, echoing through the chamber. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as the final verdict was read, her hands gripping the edge of the table. For years she had believed herself untouchable, too smart, too indispensable, too deeply embedded in the machinery of power to ever fall. But she had underestimated the strength of quiet courage, the kind that doesn't roar but endures. The judge sentenced Naomi to a lengthy prison term, the severity reflecting not only her crimes but the sheer callousness with which she had tried to erase a life for personal gain. As bailiffs moved to escort her away, Naomi turned to look at Isabel one last time. Her eyes no longer held calculation. They held something closer to disbelief, as if she still couldn't comprehend how a maid's voice had undone everything she built. Isabel met her gaze steadily, unflinching. "This is what truth looks like," she said softly, though only those close enough heard. Outside, the courthouse exploded with noise. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, supporters cheered. The story that had begun with a whispered "she's still alive" in a quiet chapel had become a national reckoning about power, greed, and the unlikeliest of heroes. Maya stepped out of the building flanked by Richard and Isabel, not as their servant but as their equal. Her image was broadcast live across countless screens, the woman who refused to let silence bury the truth. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Naomi's conviction triggered massive corporate shakeups. Board members who had colluded with her were forced to resign. Federal investigations expanded into financial crimes that reached far beyond the Whitmore estate. Isabel returned to her company with renewed strength, restructuring leadership and ensuring the corruption Naomi had nurtured could never take root again. But amidst the legal battles and media frenzy, a quieter transformation unfolded. Richard and Isabel insisted Maya leave the role of housemaid. "You're part of this family now," Isabel told her one afternoon, her voice warm but firm. "Not because of what you did for us, but because of who you are." Maya, overwhelmed, initially resisted. She didn't see herself as anything more than what she had always been. But Isabel had a way of looking at people that made them see what they were capable of. She offered Maya a position in her charitable foundation, overseeing community outreach. "You've always seen people others overlook," Isabel said. "That's what this foundation needs. People who see." Maya accepted, not out of ambition, but out of a quiet understanding that her life had changed forever. The first time she walked into the foundation's office, employees stood and applauded. She didn't know how to respond. She had spent her life moving silently through rooms, not being the reason people stood up. But as she stood there, she realized it wasn't fame they were applauding. It was courage. Naomi's downfall became a cautionary tale in business schools and media circles. But Maya's story spread in a different way. It reached people who had felt invisible, who believed their voices didn't matter. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, nurses, janitors, teachers, factory workers, thanking her for reminding them that integrity doesn't depend on status. That sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that can change everything. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, Isabel invited Maya to the gardens of the estate, the same gardens where, years ago, a nervous young maid had been told she had honest eyes. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors vivid against the clear sky. Isabel walked slowly with her cane, but her spirit was radiant. "Do you ever think," she said, settling onto a bench, "how everything changed because you spoke up at the right moment?" Maya smiled faintly. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet," she replied. "And then I stop because that's a world I don't want to imagine." Isabel reached over, placing her hand on Maya's. "You saved more than my life, Maya. You saved the truth, and that's something even death can't bury." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the sun warming their faces. Maya looked around the garden, the place where it had all begun, and realized that though her journey had started in the shadows, it had led her to a light she never expected to stand in. The reckoning. The courthouse stood like a fortress against the gray morning sky, its marble columns towering over the swarm of reporters, camera crews, and onlookers who had gathered for what was already being called the trial of the decade. Every major news network was broadcasting live. Social media was ablaze with theories, hashtags, and heated debates. Outside the gates, protesters and supporters formed opposing lines. Some held signs calling Maya a hero, others parroting Naomi's narrative of conspiracy and manipulation. Police officers lined the perimeter, holding back the crowds as black cars pulled up one by one, releasing lawyers in sharp suits, journalists with microphones, and figures of immense wealth and influence. Maya sat in the back seat of Richard's car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stared out the tinted window at the throngs of strangers chanting her name and shouting questions she couldn't hear. She had spent her life invisible, moving quietly through rooms where people rarely remembered her face. Now she was at the center of a storm that had outgrown everyone's control. She felt the weight of expectation pressing against her ribs. But beneath that weight was something stronger. The calm resolve of someone who had chosen truth, no matter the cost. Richard glanced at her from the front seat. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that came not from sleepless nights, but from the emotional grind of betrayal, love, and vengeance colliding. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Maya met his gaze in the rearview mirror. "I was ready the night I walked into that chapel," she replied. Inside the courthouse, the air was electric. The prosecution's table was stacked with evidence: Naomi's voice recordings, financial trails, digital forensics, eyewitness testimonies, and most powerfully, Isabel herself. Sitting in a wheelchair near the front row, wrapped in a cream shawl, Isabel looked fragile at first glance, but her eyes told a different story. There was no weakness in them, only a focused, icy determination. This was not a woman who had come back from the brink of death to watch quietly. She was here to make sure Naomi's empire of lies burned to ashes. Naomi entered the courtroom with calculated poise. Dressed in a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, she exuded the same cold control that had once made boardrooms bend to her will. Her lawyers flanked her like knights, carrying binders of rebuttals, motions, and rehearsed defenses. She didn't glance at Isabel. She didn't look at Maya, but her eyes met Richard's briefly. A silent exchange that carried years of manipulation and trust shattered like glass. The opening argument set the stage. The prosecution painted a chilling picture: Naomi's calculated poisoning of Isabel, her manipulation of medical personnel to declare death prematurely, her attempt to bury a living woman, and finally, her orchestration of a second attempt on Isabel's life within the hospital. They emphasized Maya's role as the crucial voice that refused to be silenced, framing the story as a battle between greed and conscience. The defense struck back with aggression. They claimed the recordings were doctored, the financial records misinterpreted, and Isabel's testimony unreliable, due to her near-death experience and medication. They painted Naomi as a loyal assistant scapegoated by a paranoid billionaire and a maid desperate for attention. Their tone was confident, but beneath the surface a faint unease was visible. The mountain of evidence was too substantial to ignore. Maya took the stand on the second day. The courtroom fell into a hush as she walked to the witness box, her dark suit simple but elegant, her shoulders straight. She spoke with the same clarity she had shown during preliminary hearings, recounting everything from the night she found Isabel's pulse to the USB recording, from confronting Naomi to stopping the hospital attack. The prosecution guided her carefully, allowing her story to unfold like a slow-burning fuse. By the time she finished, even some of Naomi's supporters in the gallery looked unsettled. Then came the cross-examination. Naomi's lead attorney was a master at psychological pressure, sharp, relentless, and skilled at twisting words. He began by questioning Maya's motives, implying romantic attachment to Richard, hinting at financial rewards, and bringing up her family's past hardships to paint her as someone who had everything to gain by inserting herself into the Whitmore family's personal tragedy. Maya didn't rise to the bait. She let him ask, let him probe, and then answered with steady precision. "I didn't gain anything when I walked into that chapel," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "I was a maid. I still am. But I saw something no one else saw, and I refused to stay silent. That's all this is. The truth doesn't depend on who's holding it. It depends on whether people are brave enough to listen." Her words landed with quiet force. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, recognizing their weight. On the third day, Isabel herself testified. Her voice was still weak, but every word cut through the courtroom like glass. She described Naomi's betrayal in measured detail, the false medication, the feeling of paralysis, the voices she heard while trapped inside her body, and the overwhelming terror of being lowered toward what she believed would be her grave. Her testimony left parts of the courtroom in tears. Naomi's lawyers tried to undermine her credibility by citing the trauma and potential hallucinations during her coma, but Isabel remained composed. "I built empires," she said firmly. "I know the difference between dreams and treachery. I trusted her with my life. She tried to bury me alive. That is not confusion, it's betrayal." As the trial unfolded, Naomi's composure began to crack. Witness after witness, document after document, dismantled the facade she had spent years constructing. Former employees came forward with stories of intimidation and bribery. Forensic analysts traced money trails directly to her. Her associate testified under a plea deal, detailing how she had hired him to finish the job at the hospital. Each revelation tightened the noose, but Naomi had not come without a final play. Midway through the trial, her defense introduced a shocking claim, a supposed recording of Richard discussing how the death would make things easier for restructuring. It was a cleverly edited splice of conversations taken out of context, designed to implicate him as complicit. For a moment, the courtroom buzzed with uncertainty. The defense seized the moment, accusing Richard of using Naomi as a scapegoat. But Richard's legal team had anticipated this. They unveiled the original unedited recordings, exposing the manipulation for what it was. The courtroom's mood shifted sharply. Naomi's desperate gambit had backfired, exposing her willingness to forge evidence to save herself. Outside the courthouse, public sentiment turned. Crowds that had once been divided now carried signs reading, "Justice for Isabel" and "Thank you, Maya." The story had transformed from scandal into a narrative of courage, truth, and the resilience of a woman who refused to stay silent. Maya became a symbol far beyond the case itself, of ordinary people holding the powerful accountable. Naomi's once formidable defense began to crumble under the combined weight of evidence, testimony, and public outrage. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, now flickered with the realization that her empire was collapsing, not through brute force, but through the unrelenting persistence of those she had underestimated. Truth on trial. The morning after the assassination attempt inside the hospital, the world surrounding the Whitmore family shifted dramatically. News stations ran the story around the clock. Billionaire's wife survives second murder plot, insider sabotage at elite hospital, and the maid who saved her again. Reporters swarmed the hospital gates, helicopters circled overhead, and camera flashes illuminated the lobby at all hours. For Maya, who had once moved through life unnoticed, slipping silently between rooms, doing work that no one remembered, unless it was left undone, the sudden spotlight was disorienting. Her name, once just a line on a payroll, was now being debated on television panels by people who had never met her. Some called her a hero. Others, echoing Naomi's narrative, painted her as a calculating opportunist who had inserted herself into a billionaire's tragedy for fame. Maya didn't care about the noise. Her world narrowed to the four walls of Isabel's room, the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the quiet strength of a woman slowly reclaiming her life. Isabel's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within a week, she was able to sit up with assistance, her voice still raspy but growing stronger by the day. The first words she spoke clearly were to Maya. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice like paper rustling. Maya squeezed her hand gently, tears threatening to spill. "I never left," she replied softly. That fragile exchange carried more weight than any grand declaration. Richard visited every day, often late at night after back-to-back legal meetings, corporate strategy sessions, and interviews. He no longer carried the air of a distant mogul. The near loss of Isabel had stripped away the armor of power and revealed a man desperate to protect the woman he loved and the life they had built. He would sit by Isabel's bedside, sometimes in silence, sometimes whispering promises that only she could hear. And every time his gaze met Maya's, there was a shared understanding, a silent alliance born not of hierarchy, but of truth. Naomi, however, refused to disappear quietly. When her associate was arrested at the hospital, she denied all connection, hiring an aggressive legal team that immediately began filing motions to discredit the evidence. She launched a media counter-offensive, sitting down for a carefully staged television interview. Dressed in white, her makeup flawless, she told a trembling voice story about being betrayed by people I trusted, and devastated to learn about these accusations. She painted herself as a loyal friend and employee who had been framed by jealous staff and manipulated by an emotionally unstable maid with delusions of grandeur. The performance was polished, precise, and aimed at swaying public sentiment before the legal storm reached full force. But Richard was ready. His legal team had already compiled an extensive dossier. Naomi's voice recordings, financial, trails linking her to offshore accounts, encrypted messages to her hired associate, and testimonies from staff members she had coerced over the years. The evidence was overwhelming, but Naomi was cunning. She countered every piece with claims of fabrication, hacking, and deepfakes. She even accused Richard of staging the entire ordeal to remove her from the company and consolidate power, claim that found traction among a few board members who had benefited from her schemes. Amid this escalating war, Maya found herself unexpectedly thrust into the legal spotlight. The prosecution saw her as their key witness, the one who had first noticed Isabel's faint pulse, the one who had recorded Naomi's incriminating conversation, the one who had confronted danger in the hospital. But the defense saw her as their easiest target. They launched a campaign to dig into her past, her family's financial struggles, a teenage misdemeanor that had long been expunged, and even her immigration records. They twisted benign facts into malicious narratives. Headlines began to shift tone. Heroine or opportunist? Maid's mysterious past raises questions. One afternoon, Maya sat in a small conference room with Richard's lawyers as they prepared her for the upcoming preliminary hearings. The lead attorney, a composed woman with steel in her voice, said bluntly, "They're going to attack you. They'll try to make you seem unreliable, emotional, unstable. You need to be ready." Maya's hands clenched in her lap, but her eyes didn't waver. "They can say what they want," she said quietly. "I know what I saw, and I'm not going to let her walk free." Meanwhile, Isabel's strength grew with each passing day. Her voice returned slowly, and along with it came memories, fragmented at first, then clearer. She remembered Naomi's presence in the final hours before her death, the strange coldness in her assistant's eyes, the sensation of a needle pressing into her skin under the guise of medication. She remembered hearing whispers, Naomi's voice instructing someone to prepare the body quickly. And most chillingly, she remembered the coffin closing in her mind, the darkness pressing in, the helplessness of being trapped in a body that could not move or speak. One evening, Isabel asked Maya to sit beside her bed. Her voice was still, hoarse, but her words carried the authority of a woman who had built empires. "They think I'm weak," she said slowly. They think because I was silent, I was powerless. But silence was forced on me. I will speak. And when I do, I will make sure Naomi never hurts anyone again." Maya nodded, moved by the steel in Isabel's frail frame. For the first time, Isabel wasn't just a patient fighting to survive. She was preparing to fight back. Naomi sensed this shift too. Her spies within the hospital fed her information. Isabel's improving condition made her increasingly dangerous to Naomi's defense. So Naomi pivoted to a more insidious strategy. Instead of another physical attack, she began leaking documents to the press, real and fabricated, designed to smear Richard and Isabel's legacy. Allegations of tax evasion, claims that Isabel had falsified charity funds, rumors of affairs. It didn't matter whether the stories were true. What mattered was creating enough noise to blur the truth and weaken public confidence before the trial. Richard responded by tightening security, both around Isabel and within his company. He hired forensic auditors to trace every financial thread Naomi had spun. He coordinated with federal authorities to fast-track charges, and quietly, behind the scenes, he began dismantling the board alliances Naomi had built, one by exposing their complicity or offering deals they couldn't refuse. Maya's role expanded as well. She was no longer just a witness. She became Isabel's confidant, Richard's ally, and the moral center of a story spiraling into legal and political warfare. Every time she stepped into a courtroom, camera flashes followed. But instead of shrinking, she stood taller. Her testimony during the preliminary hearing was calm, precise, and devastating. She recounted the night she felt Isabel's pulse, the recording of Naomi's orders, and the hospital attack. The courtroom fell silent when she spoke of holding Isabel's hand while believing the world had given up on her. Even the judge seemed moved. Naomi's lawyers tried to break her during cross-examination, accusing her of fabricating events for attention, implying romantic motives toward Richard, even suggesting she had been paid off. Maya didn't flinch. She looked them in the eye and said, "I cleaned their floors. I served their guests. I saw things no one else saw because no one ever looked at me. But I was there. And the truth doesn't need me to be perfect. It just needs me to stand." The testimony reverberated outside the courtroom. News outlets replayed it. Social media exploded with support. And for the first time, Naomi's polished mask began to crack in public. Her usual confident smirk faltered as the narrative shifted against her. But even as the legal tides turned, Naomi wasn't finished. She had one final card to play, a secret she had held in reserve, buried deep in a place where no one would think to look. And as the trial loomed closer, she began to set it in motion, determined to pull everyone down with her if she fell.